Kia ora, bula, kia orana, tilofa, malualele, and it's great to be here with Dave for Tūpālangi in a Piece and Easy pod. I'm Glenn Murphy, and I'm based here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and really enjoying doing this podcast with Dave.
And good whara morning, lo you whara olgeta. I'm Dave Dewar, currently based in Rarotonga, but previously based in Suva, and working with Glenn over the last 5 years to help businesses from New Zealand, Australia, and around the region be their best selves, I suppose you could say, in this region. It's been a fantastic part of my career and life, and I've really enjoyed telling those stories and really excited to be doing them with Glenn on this weekly podcast.
And in this episode of Tūpālangi in a Piece and Easy pod, we do a bit of a discussion about the Asia Development Bank, who've been pretty busy in the Pacific this week.
But before we do that, Glenn, it's customary to talk about how the week's been, and it's great to see you back in Waiheke, back on dry land. And how has the back to reality adjustment been for you?
Yeah, it's been pretty good actually. But after living the life of the rich and famous on Sydney Harbour for a few days, I'm back, as you can see, back to the never-ending renovation project here on Waiheke Island. But you can see behind me, for those who are on video, for those who aren't, I've actually now got a wall behind me. What about you, Dave? What's your week been?
Well, we've had a pretty good week here. It's a heck of a lot of rain still, so I'm actually I'm wearing the colours of Avachu, which is my children's sports club, the blue and the yellow. But I'm still waiting to see if they're actually going to get to start playing rugby league this year. They've been rained off for 2 trainings and for 1 game because it's just been pouring buckets here in Rarotonga. But it's rain that we need to have, so we take the good with the bad, and water tanks are getting full, and just still trying to see if they'll actually get to play a game of rugby league tomorrow.
Well, hopefully the boys are still able to do tackling practice in the hallway at home, mate.
That's my fear. That is my fear. They enjoy doing that a little bit too much. So getting them out and running around is really what we want to see happening, even if it's sliding through some of the puddles.
Indeed. So, Dave, Asia Development Bank, they've been making a bit of noise this week in Pacific, and so we thought in this episode we'd just have a bit of discussion about what they're all about, what they've been up to, and how they work, and particularly what the implication is for businesses who are operating in the spaces that they work in. So, what's been happening this week with them, Dave?
Yeah, super interesting organisation, Glenn. The ADB, the Asian Development Bank, is probably one of the acronyms you hear most commonly around the Pacific, especially if you're engaged in infrastructure work. They're a major funder, and I suppose you'd call them a market maker of infrastructure around the region. So at one level, it's a bank. It lends money to governments so that they can build and borrow to build the infrastructure that they need. But it also has a very active portfolio of grants and loans and concessional finance directly to businesses to help them deliver those projects as well. And what's interesting this week is actually the president of the Asian Development Bank, a gentleman by the name of Masato Kando, has been traveling around the region, visiting Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Fiji. He has opened a new office for the Asian Development Bank in Solomon Islands. He has launched a new program in Vanuatu, and he has signed a new partnership and also sort of opened a new office in Fiji. They always had an office there, the Pacific Sub-Regional Office, but they've moved across the road into some very, very fancy new premises in the beautiful FHL Tower. So he came along to open that one as well, and there's an incredible photo of him standing on the steps with all of the team there, and you just get a sense of the size. I think in the 5 years,
are we talking?
It's big. Yeah, it's a big office. I think in the 5 years I was there, they expanded from about 30 people to now over 70. So they've doubled in size, and that's just in Suva.
Yeah.
But of course, they've opened these other offices in other markets as well. So really expanding their presence.
Hey, so tell me, they've opened the Solomon Islands office this week is one of the big things. What does an office like that do? What's the purpose of having an office, a kind of remote office for an organization like ADB?
Yeah, great question. Previously, they've been covering Solomon Islands predominantly out of the Sydney office. So having that direct connection now on the ground with people that are there that are able to engage day to day is super valuable, particularly when you're an organization that lends money to governments. And so when you have these discussions with your finance ministers and your procuring authorities and various other industry players, you've got a real sense on the ground from living there where the pressure points are, where the challenges are, and also where the opportunities are in terms of funding. So the big thing with the Honiara office is, of course, this very large project that is taking place on the outskirts of Honiara called the Tina River Hydro project, and this is a major hydroelectric dam. It's been going for a few years now, but it's expected to provide something like 70% of the power in Honiara. So the opportunity arose to go and have a look at that. And of course, also look at some of the other projects that the ADB is supporting, for example, the University of the South Pacific campus in Honiara.
Dave, we'll come back to really what the the sort of implication for business and how businesses should think about engaging with ADB. But just to put it in a bit of context again, what's your info in terms of the overall budget that the ADB is dealing with? I mean, what's the context? You talked about them being a market maker, so that implies that they've pretty got a fair bit of resource there. But what does that look like?
I think one other thing to just sort of talk about in terms of the opening of the Honiara office and that increased investment that you're seeing from the ADB across the Pacific in particular, but also across their entire sphere of operations, which goes from Georgia in the Caucasus all the way across to kind of the easternmost Pacific, is that it's got a very, very large pool of capital. Now, what happened about a couple of years ago is that they managed to unlock a significantly larger portion of capital that they can deploy. So we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars.
Tell me how you find hundreds of billions of dollars, because I wouldn't mind doing that. I've been trying to win lotto, that hasn't worked, and so if there's another way, I'm all in. So how did that happen?
Well, start taking notes carefully, Glenn, because I think that the first step is to have a lot of money to begin with, like any good success story. But yeah, so through a combination of different sort of factors, and at one level it's quite dry, but at another level it's quite interesting. So what they've managed to do is kind of three things really. One is they've got a pool of capital sort of sitting there that they have to keep aside for a rainy day, I suppose. And what they've managed to do is to change their structural funding rules to be able to release a lot more of that pool, but still maintain their credit rating, their AAA credit rating, which is absolutely essential. And the way that they've been able to do that is quite interesting. So, firstly, they've got a program where they've managed to get individual developed country governments to guarantee some of their loans. So they've got governments like Denmark, Sweden, Japan, who have agreed to say, look, we will step in as guarantors of some of this money that's been deployed, enabling you, ADB, to deploy more of that capital that you've got sitting in that vault there. They've got a pretty cool swap arrangement with the African Development Bank. So essentially that's saying if a project in the Pacific or Asia within the ADB operations defaults and you need to pay that back, you can call on some of the capital reserve from the African Development Bank to kind of meet that. So, and then also I think just sort of looking at their overall, funding rules and sort of saying, well, look, actually based on much better data that we've got over the many, many decades of operations that we've been running, we have a much better idea of the risk profile and risk premium that we need to attach to some of these future projects. So based on that data, we know and we can be confident that we can deploy a much greater proportion of that capital into the market than we've currently had sitting there. So those sort of three things have enabled it to quite significantly increase how much it deploys. And the numbers I've seen are sort of, they're going from about $25 billion of deployable capital up to about $40 billion a year. So, very significant 40% increase, per year across their operations.
40 billion, and that's US dollars we're talking, I'm assuming.
That is. So it's big sums of money. So, this is, and that's across their entire sphere of operations. So not all of that's going into the Pacific. but a significant proportion of it is. They are a major funder, both in terms of debt financing and debt capital, so repayable money, but also they have a package of grants as well. And that's increasingly where they're playing is.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, it does sound like they've put a lot of thought into how they can optimize the funds that they have. Which, yes, you say it might be a little dry, but actually relevance in terms of being able to be effective, because while 40 billion sounds like a hell of a lot of money, I know, it's never enough when we're talking infrastructure and climate change and resilience type projects, and energy. So, yeah, it sounds like they've done some really pretty impressive work over the last few years.
Yeah, I think so. This is where they really excel, I think, knowing how to mobilize large sums of capital for development outcomes at that very high, sort of structural level around the region and around the world. Where I think they are also growing their operation is in two other areas. One is around procurement, and the other is around direct to private sector lending. So on the procurement side, they are taking a much more hands-on approach to the administration of the funds that they give out. So if you think about an infrastructure project, it's a bit like your renovation, or building a house. You go and get a loan from you go and get a loan from a bank, and the bank's going to say, look, I'm not going to make you choose your builder, I'm not going to make you choose your materials, but I am going to sort of insist that you do have some minimum standards about the property, that it meets certain guidelines. But I'm not going to reach too far into the weeds about how you choose to go about designing and executing your property. Now, when it comes to an infrastructure asset, they've got to be a bit more hands-on than that, because they need to manage all of that risk. They can't rely on some sort of government authority to make sure that things are compliant with all sorts of codes and that kind of thing. They have to protect that investment. And so what you're starting to see is a lot more discipline and thought being put into their procurement policy. So a big shift, a really, really big shift that's relevant for businesses in the region is occurred in the last few years as well, which is a shift from a pretty basic procurement model of simply going with what's called the lowest cost compliant bid, i.e. whoever's the lowest bidder on a project wins it, through to a value for money framework and the use of what they call merit point criteria. So both the ADB as well as the World Bank, who are really leaders in global procurement policy, have shifted to this approach to be a lot more specific about what sort of attributes they're looking to see, and that bidders and suppliers have to meet when they're bidding in for infrastructure projects.
And Dave, with that, am I right in thinking that there's a lot more emphasis as part of that criteria on partnership with local companies, local people, local businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. So a really key part of that merit point criteria is an emphasis on localization of projects. So it's not enough to say that you're going to use locals in your project. It's actually now, I think, something between 10 and 20% of the weighting of the success of your bid is going to be put down to how credible and how genuine and how effective your engagement with and building of a local workforce is going to be.
Yeah. And what about the element of things like maintenance? And I know in New Zealand recently in the infrastructure space, there's been quite a bit of discussion about the policies and the fact that a lot of the agencies and ministries actually don't even really have an asset register of what they own, let alone then putting effort into maintenance, and that there's a lot more policy work being done to make sure that investment in maintenance is a bigger part of what's going on. Does that come into play with Pacific? Because I'm sure that's as big a issue there as it is in New Zealand. But is that part of what they look at now as well?
Yeah, look, it definitely is. The total asset life cost is still an ongoing challenge. It's something that infrastructure funders and stewards of infrastructure, which ultimately are the governments that own these assets over time, have to be conscious of. It's very difficult to build those into an initial capex loan to build these projects. But as you say, Glenn, it's something that we struggle with in New Zealand as well. We've had that release of the 30-year infrastructure plan this week. The minister, Chris Bishop, was saying that one of the big things that we that we've failed to do in New Zealand as well for a long time, is to keep detailed registers of what we have, the depreciation schedule, and keeping an eye on that asset maintenance. But some of the other things that they look at, which are related to that, is really around climate resilience. So I think that's kind of code for looking at asset life
Right.
cycle and how long it's gonna stay, as well as just sort of some of the technical specs. Just making sure that you've got technical quality, I suppose, in terms of the materials you're using and the people that you're bringing to the project, and that longevity.
Just moving on then, and sort of talking a little bit now about how private sector and business should engage. And I know in the roles that you've had, you're quite often, approached by businesses to say, "Oh, hey, can you get me an introduction to ADB because I want to talk to them about this project or this funding." And oftentimes it's like, well, actually, you don't want to talk to ADB because they're not the ones making that decision about the project. Going back to your comments about how these things actually get put together, you actually need to be talking to the decision maker who's got the funds from ADB. So, in that context, can you kind of just talk a little bit about how you think business should now be thinking about that massive funding and how to actually, I don't know, if you're a mid-sized New Zealand or Australian business, how do you take advantage of that? How do you get involved?
Yeah, to go back to that analogy about you doing your renovation, it's a bit like your builder taking a look at your house and going, I know what Glenn needs, but I don't want to talk to Glenn. I'm going to go and talk to Westpac Bank or whoever he's got his mortgage with and see if I can get them to make him, build it in the way that I want.
Right.
You wouldn't do that as a builder, and of course, it doesn't make sense really to do that in an infrastructure context either, because ultimately, it's a government that's going to own this asset, that's going to be politically responsible for the success or failure of that asset over many years. And the ADB doesn't want to take that political risk, and nor is it really appropriate. So you really need that government hands-on ownership of it, and it's always going to be important, I think, for a business to have as its first and primary point of contact with the government agencies that are the procurement owners of these projects. So your first point is always to the businesses: look, it's imperative that you've got that understanding of what a government needs. Doubly so if you've got a project that you think is a good idea but is not yet funded. So there's no point going to the ADB and saying country X needs this project if country X doesn't agree with that. That being said, it's still super important to talk to the ADB and to get that understanding of what it is that they're looking for. The ADB and banks like them do have a much more hands-on role with the implementation and the procurement of some of these jobs than, say, the bank that you might have borrowed money from for your renovation in a domestic context. It's going to be a bit complex, I think, over the next few years. And so having been part of that evolving conversation with the likes of ADB, as well as, procuring agencies, and understanding what it is that they're trying to achieve and how they think that can best be, given effect to, I think is still worth it. So
What's the most effective way of doing that, Dave? Is it, I mean, I'm assuming, that they strive for transparency, and so I'm therefore assuming that a lot of that information that you're talking about is publicly available through websites. And I'm assuming also things like the conferences, the Pacific Infrastructure Conference biannually in Brisbane, things like that are probably important forums to be able to make those connections. Is that right? And are there other ways that you'd suggest?
yeah, I think that is right. There's never any substitute for actually going and talking to people face to face. This information is very transparent. It is very publicly available. There's a difference, I think, between available and accessible. I think the ADB would be the first to admit that its website is not the easiest to navigate. So where you do have an opportunity to, go to these places in person, and participate in some of these conferences, it's really invaluable. I guess we can give a bit of an advertorial for the upcoming conference and business opportunities seminar that's happening in Nandi from the 25th to the 27th of May. That is being organised by the ADB in conjunction with a range of other development partners like the World Bank, the Australian government, the New Zealand government, and others. And it's really aimed at helping the private sector to understand where the opportunities are, how they can engage, some of the things they need to think about to be effective in this part of the world.
And attendance to that is open to any business that has a relevant interest in it. Doesn't matter about size or anything like that. If you're interested in getting involved and meeting these people, it's open.
Better yet, it's actually free. Well, I mean, it's, you have to sort of pay for your accommodation and travel. Confirmation about that. It's out there now on the ADB website. It'll be super popular and definitely one to get along to, especially, as I say, for those businesses in the Pacific, because, with this new emphasis on localization, you are critical to these projects.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, before we started recording this show, you talked about, I think, what's it called? The Frontier Seed Fund?
Yeah,
Which sounds like quite
exactly
a
right.
different thing.
Yeah. No, that's quite a cool development. And I guess the other initiative that was launched during the latest visit by the ADB president when he was in Vanuatu is another new initiative, very similar to the Frontier Seed Fund. It's called the Wayfinder program. And this is the ADB investing directly into private sector businesses within the Pacific as a way to unlock further capital and opportunity and development by leveraging, co-financing out of the private sector. So the first of those was the Frontier Seed program. That's really targeted at SMEs. And the way that works is the ADB will invest reasonably small sums up to kind of, 500K. Small by ADB standards, quite large by SME standards. And that's to what they call gazelle businesses, high growth potential businesses. They target those with about over a year in operation with about 250K USD revenue, and you can get that concessional loan, which only becomes repayable once you hit these revenue targets. And there's some really interesting kind of concessional elements to it that you can pay the whole thing off immediately if you want, or you can stagger it. You only become on the hook for it once you hit the revenue targets that have been collectively agreed. And plus, they bring to bear a whole lot of their own, we mentioned that financial wizardry that they've got and capability within the organization. There have been some great successes in there, and I hope we can profile some of those Frontier Seed businesses on the show in the coming weeks.
Yeah. Is that sort of funding or that program only for Pacific-based businesses, or could a relevant business from New Zealand or Australia apply or be part of that, or is it purely Pacific domiciled?
It's not limited by nationality, but it is meant to be for businesses that are in those countries that are delivering an outcome that meets certain development objectives. So, like a lot of these development programs, they're not there to compete directly with the private sector. They're there to kind of fill perceived market gaps. But the other one that's interesting is this Wayfinder program, and that's similarly organized to the Frontier Seed program, but at a larger order of magnitude. That's one where they're looking at kind of between $5 to $25 million of capital. And the big announcement that they made was an initial investment in in a submarine cable infrastructure. So the Tum Tum cable, it's called, and the idea is that this is it's a privately led submarine cable connecting Fiji and Vanuatu and providing some redundancy as well as, commercial benefit in terms of greater, cheaper, faster, more reliable data availability in Vanuatu. And the ADB has tipped some money into that from its own financing pool, co-finance with other private sector investors in order to sort of de-risk some of that private sector lending and hopefully unlock more capital for growth.
So, Dave, one of the things we've talked about quite a bit over the last few weeks is the increasing connectivity and the importance of digitalization across the whole of Pacific. Just another good example of that connectivity happening with the Tum Tum cable, and great to see somebody like ADB with this Wayfinder program able to really contribute significant capital that, as you say, does de-risk the investment from the private sector point of view and really make it possible.
I think there'll be a lot of businesses from New Zealand, Australia, and across the Pacific who will be very interested in the opportunities that creates for some of the projects that I know have been sitting there in people's minds and on drawing boards for many months and years now, just waiting for that sort of de-risk capital to help unlock them.
Hey, Dave, as we kind of close out this conversation about ADB, I guess my impression just from this Talanoa is that there's quite a lot of change, like really significant change. And if you kind of sum it up, you talked about this massive release of new capital through some quite clever ways of freeing that up and making a lot more money available. You've talked about the change in kind of procurement philosophy from a lowest cost to actually really taking into account other factors around who is successful in winning a project bid. And particularly within that, I think we've really highlighted that a requirement for Pacific organizations, Pacific people to be heavily involved, not just in doing the work, but also in learning and knowledge transfer. So they're able to keep successful businesses going. And then finally, you've highlighted some really interesting new innovations in terms of the way that they're applying funds through the Frontier Seed program and through the Wayfinder program to be able to do things in a really different way that, as we say, helps local businesses develop as well as de-risking major programs. So it sounds like, quite a significant shift if you add all that up.
It really is, Glenn. And, I like the ADB. I'm a fan. It really is an organization that is out to do a lot of good in the region. But all of that being said, there's a heck of a lot of change happening. As these are some really significant shifts and evolutions that are in the process of happening. Actually having them kind of flow through into the market is going to take time, and there'll be parts that are messy. But the key thing, I think, is for businesses to be aware that there is that change taking place. There is a real desire from the ADB and others like it, the World Bank and the Australian government with its new lending facility and others, to see greater engagement by the private sector in some of these projects.
Yeah, and I guess that's probably the final need is for when we go back to business is just A, to have a bit of patience, B, to work with these organizations rather than against them. And I think, something we've probably seen before is a lot of these government procurement bodies are dealing with massive projects and they actually have very limited resources themselves. And so, business can get frustrated by the lack of progress at times. But I think there is genuine constraint within these organizations at just how much they can get through because of both skills and just pure numbers of resources that are available to do it. And so I think, the more that business kind of understands that limitation and rather than getting frustrated by it, actually works with it to help the process.
I agree, Glenn. I mean, it's fantastic to see the evolution of these policies. I absolutely agree with them. They're a very, very important contribution to quality procurement, quality infrastructure in the region. But the fact is, we've introduced a lot more complexity in the procuring process, and that becomes a lot more work for some of these organisations that have been used to a slightly simpler model. And actually, the New Zealand government, our friends at Foreign Affairs, MFAT, have invested quite a lot in growing procuring capability and procurement capability across the region. Ultimately, you can have the best policy on paper, but if it's being implemented in a way, by a small under-resourced team that may not have the familiarity with it, as a minimum, it's gonna take time to come to grips with it, and there's risks in that too.
So look, hey, thanks, Dave. I think that's been a fantastic discussion about the ADB and where they're heading and what they're doing. I hope it's been useful to some of the business people that are listening to our podcast. Look, so this week on Two Palangi and a Piece and Easy Pod, we've had a good talanoa about the Asia Development Bank, the work they're doing at the moment and the things that are changing and have been changing over the last few years, and how business should be thinking about engaging with them. So Dave, any final thoughts, any major things business should be aware of in the coming week? And would you like to read us out for the week?
What I wanted to finish us off with was going back to a bit of a scoop, I suppose, that we talked about last week. And that was that there was this conference summit taking place in Honolulu, and that's happening in a few days' time in the coming week. And I definitely think that's worth being aware of. It's called the Pacific Infrastructure Investment Conference, or the Pacific Agenda Summit is the other name that I've seen used for it, hosted by the East-West Centre in Honolulu. And this is, I think, going to be the first expression of a US policy around encouraging greater private sector engagement and investment in the regions. The idea is that that event will bring together senior leaders from across the Pacific. New Zealand and Australia will be represented at that as well, but also private sector businesses. And the idea is to discuss and agree, I think, on a bit of an investment pipeline. One is around digitalization and data. So I think we can expect the likes of Google and Amazon and others to be represented. One is around critical minerals. It's a somewhat controversial topic across the Pacific amongst different governments, but certainly something that, as we know, the US is particularly interested in. But also just sort of talking about, I think, some of the infrastructure that the US invests in, predominantly in the North Pacific, particularly around that defense sector. I think, that there's no accident that it's taking place in Honolulu, which is also the headquarters of what they call Indo-PACOM, the Indo-Pacific Defense Command, part of the US military. The summit itself then feeds into another conference, which is called the Pacific Alliance on Collaboration and Technology, or PACT. And that'll be happening on the 26th and 27th of February. And that's an annual event that looks at some of those business pipelines around, how technology and data and tech providers can provide some of those services that are in demand in the region. So
I'm just wondering whether one of us should shoot up to Hawaii for a few days.
Well, one of us might have been invited to that. I certainly expect that a number of our friends from foreign affairs ministries and things will be heading along to that, and potentially some from the business sector as well. In the meantime, I guess that's us for the week, Glenn. So thanks very much to everyone for listening. Thanks very much for the feedback that you've been sending through about the episodes we had over the last few weeks, particularly that fantastic conversation we had with Sir Ewan Smith last week. Please keep sending it through, either through WhatsApp or LinkedIn, or through our email address, which is 2.palagi, PALAGI, @gmail.com, to let us know about anything else that takes your fancy or interest, or that you'd like us to profile as part of this podcast. In the meantime, this has been Tu Palangi in a Pisinesi Pod for the week ending 21st of February.